A ranger's warning. The unspoken rules of national parks. We think we know our national parks. We see them on postcards and in documentaries, vast, silent cathedrals of nature, managed by smiling men and women in crisp, flat-brimmed hats. We are told they are places of peace, of logic, governed by the simple, understandable laws of the natural world. But this is only the surface story, the one told to the millions who visit the manicured trails and designated viewpoints. There is another story, a deeper, quieter, and much darker one. It is a story known only to those who have spent their lives patrolling the borderlands between our world and the true, untamed wilderness. The park rangers. They are keepers of secrets. Not secrets of state, but secrets of the earth itself. Truths about what happens when you stray too far from the path, about what lingers in the silent places, and about the real reasons so many of them leave the service long before their time. They leave not because of age, but because of the weight of what they have seen. Tonight we open one of their gray files. This is the testament of a man who spent his life in the deep woods and learned that the most important rules are not written in any guidebook. Part 1. There's a group of people who live deep in the park. They aren't rangers. They're keepers. My name is Arthur Coleman. Before the tremor in my hands made holding a pen a chore, and before my memories started to feel like photographs faded by the sun, I was a park ranger. My story begins in the spring of 1978. I was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in forestry and a heart so full of romantic notions about the wilderness it's a wonder I didn't burst. I saw the park as the last bastion of purity in a world choked by concrete and ambition. It was a cathedral built of granite and pine, a sanctuary of silence and raw, unforgiving honesty. To me, the towering peaks were gods, the ancient sequoias were prophets, and the rushing rivers sang a hymn as old as time itself. I didn't just want to work in the park. I wanted to be a part of it, to dissolve into its grandeur. Youthful idealism is a potent drug. The wilderness, I would soon learn, has a harsh and permanent way of sobering you up. The park I will not use its official name, not in this Telingi's a titan of the American landscape. It sprawls across more than 2 million acres of jagged peaks, alpine meadows, shadowy canyons, and forests so dense that sunlight struggles to kiss the ground. To say you know it all is the boast of a fool. Even after 30 years of walking its trails and flying over its canopy, I can confidently say I have only ever scratched the surface of its true, immense face. The public, the tourists who flock here in summer, they see even less. They are confined to the 10%, the curated sliver of land accessible by asphalt roads and trails as manicured as a garden path. They take their photographs at designated viewpoints, have their carefully planned picnics at designated tables, and drive away in their air-conditioned cars, feeling they've experienced nature. They have no idea. The rangers, we live on the border. We are the gatekeepers standing on the threshold between that tame, curated world and the other 90% of vast, unpredictable, and sometimes profoundly unwelcoming wilderness. Every new ranger is indoctrinated with the official rules. You learn them by heart until they become a second language. Fire hazard protocols, calculated in tables of humidity and wind speed. Wildlife encounter procedures: what to do for a black bear versus a grizzly, how to handle a curious mountain lion. Search and rescue grids, first aid, the proper way to write a citation. It's a thick binder of human attempts to impose order on a world that operates on principles far older than order. But the real rules, the ones that keep you alive, are not in any binder. They are taught in hushed tones, away from the sterile light of the ranger station. They are passed down from the old-timers, the men with tired, knowing eyes and a permanent reluctance to speak too loudly after the sun dips below the ridgeline. These are the unspoken rules. And my education began with a man named Dale. Dale was a lifer. He was cut from the very granite of the mountains he patrolled. His face was a roadmap of laugh lines and worry creases, his hands thick and calloused, his hair the color of salt and pepper. He'd been a ranger since the 1950s, and he moved through the forest with a quiet economy of motion that made me, in all my youthful vigor, look like a clumsy oaf. I was assigned to him my first week. Our task was a simple one: clearing a fallen ponderosa pine that had blocked the popular Eagle Creek Trail. It was a warm, clear day. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. I was hacking away at a branch with my axe, feeling strong and useful, when Dale, who was working the other end of the log with a crosscut saw, stopped. He didn't look at me. He was staring past me, into the dark, silent wall of trees that bordered the trail. "Art," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't travel far. "You see that trail marker over there?" He pointed with his chin to the small, routed wooden sign, a simple brown rectangle with a hiker symbol on it. "Yeah, I see it," I said, pausing to wipe sweat from my brow. "You think that's for the tourists? To keep M from getting lost?" I chuckled. It seemed an obvious question. "Well, yeah, that's what they're for, aren't they?" Dale slowly reeled in his side of the saw and stood up, stretching his back. He pulled a pouch of tobacco and rolling papers from his breast pocket. "Partly," he said, expertly rolling a cigarette with one hand. "That's the reason we give M. But that's not the whole truth." He lit the cigarette and took a long, thoughtful drag. The smoke coiled into the still air. "That marker and this trail, they ain't just for keeping people in. They're for keeping other things out. Think of it like a pact. An agreement." I was still smiling, but a sliver of confusion pierced my good mood. A pact? With who? The bears? The squirrels? Dale's gaze finally met mine, and there was no humor in his eyes. They were as serious as a headstone. "Something like that," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You'll learn. This place, it has a rhythm, a balance. Our job, the real job, isn't to manage the park. No man can manage this. Our job is to manage the people. We keep M on the paths. We keep M from getting too loud, too greedy, too disrespectful. We keep M from upsetting the balance. Because when the balance gets upset, this place has a way of righting itself. And it ain't pretty." I didn't know what to say. He sounded less like a park ranger and more like some ancient priest tending to a fickle god. I dismissed it as old-timer philosophy, a bit of mountain poetry. I would come to learn, in the most terrifying way imaginable, that Dale was not speaking in metaphors. He was being brutally, literally honest. The first few years were a whirlwind of the mundane. I pulled tourists' cars out of ditches, mediated disputes at crowded campgrounds, and spent more hours than I can count reminding people not to feed the chipmunks. But beneath the surface of this daily routine, the stories circulated. They were whispered in the station's break room late at night, or shared over a cheap beer at the outpost, the one lonely tavern that stood just outside the park's western entrance. Stories of strange things, events that defied easy explanation. These weren't ghost stories meant to spook the rookies. They were spoken with a quiet, somber resignation, usually by the older, more seasoned rangers. Hicks, a ranger with 20 years in the Southern District, told one of the first I ever heard. It was about a German hiker, a man named Klaus Richter. He was an experienced mountaineer, meticulously prepared. He'd signed the backcountry register, detailing his plan for a 10-day solo trek through the unforgiving Granite Tooth region. He was due back on a Tuesday. By Friday, when he hadn't emerged, we launched a search. The search was massive. We had teams on the ground, a helicopter in the air. For 3 days, we found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no abandoned gear, no tracks. It was as if the man had simply evaporated. Then, on the fourth day, a ground team found his campsite. It was miles off any known trail, in a small, sheltered bowl of a valley. The scene was what made Hick's voice drop to a whisper when he told the story. There was no tent, no sleeping bag, no backpack, no stove, no food. All the essential gear a man like Richter would never be without was gone. But on a large, flat rock in the center of the clearing sat a single, neatly folded pile of clothes. His hiking pants, his shirt, his thermal underwear. They were clean. Not just clean, but seemingly washed and pressed. Folded with military precision. Next to the pile were his boots, the laces removed and coiled neatly on top. That was it. The search continued for 2 more weeks. The dogs couldn't catch a scent past that clearing. The helicopters saw nothing. They never found Klaus Richter. Not a bone, not a button, not a scrap of his expensive gear. The official report concluded he likely fell into a crevasse or was taken by a predator that dragged him off. But none of us believed it. Animals tear, they don't fold. Crevasses don't wash and press your clothes. It was an act of impossible, chilling tidiness. Then there was the Peterson family. A family of 4 from Ohio: mom, dad, 2 kids under 10. They were reported missing from the Two Forks campground, one of our most popular and safe front country sites. Their minivan was still in its designated spot. Their large family tent was fully erected. When the Rangers unzipped the flap, they found one of the most disturbing scenes I ever heard described. The camp stove was set up on the picnic table. On it was a frying pan with 4 strips of bacon, cold and stiff in a disk of congealed grease. 4 plates were set, each with a serving of scrambled eggs, also cold. 4 mugs of orange juice sat untouched, a thin layer of dust already settling on the surface. A child's stuffed bear was sitting on one of the benches, its button eyes staring at the silent, uneaten breakfast. The family was gone. All 4 of them. They had simply ceased to be there, somewhere between cooking breakfast and eating it. The search was even more intensive. The FBI was called in. Theories flew: a kidnapping, a family that simply decided to walk away from their lives. But none of it made sense. Their wallets, keys, and IDs were in the tent. The car was full of gas. Who walks away from their life in the middle of cooking bacon? Like with Klaus Richter, the search yielded nothing. Not a footprint leading away from the campsite. It was another clean, inexplicable, and total absence. It was as if the wilderness had simply erased them. Dale, my mentor, had a phrase for it. He'd listen to these stories, nodding slowly, and say, "The park was just tidying up." The phrase used to chill me to the bone. It implied a will and intelligence, a housekeeper sweeping away a mess. I didn't truly understand. Not in my gut. These were stories told by others, second-hand accounts that I could still, with some effort, rationalize. My own personal education baptism into the unspoken reality of the park came on a cool, overcast autumn evening in my 5th year of service. A report had come in about a possible illegal trapper operating in the northern sector. This was a rugged, rarely visited area known for its labyrinthine forests and the sudden, disorienting fog that could roll in off the high peaks without warning. I took the patrol myself. It was a chance to get deep into the backcountry, to be alone in the raw, untamed heart of the place I loved. I left my truck at an old logging road and pushed in on foot, following a game trail that was little more than a whisper through the ferns and undergrowth. I was hours in, the familiar landmarks of the Ranger District fading behind me, replaced by an older, wilder geography. The feeling of solitude was immense, and at first, exhilarating. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the underside of the cloud cover in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the mood of the forest began to change. The exhilaration bled away, replaced by a low, persistent hum of anxiety. It started with that classic sensation, the one every outdoorsman knows, the feeling of being watched. But this was different. It wasn't the hot, focused gaze of a predator like a cougar. I'd felt that before. This was a calm, dispassionate, and pervasive awareness. It felt like the trees themselves had eyes. It was the feeling a microbe might have on a slide under a biologist's lens. I was being observed, but not with any emotion I could recognize. Then came the silence. It wasn't a gradual quieting. It was sudden, as if a switch had been flipped. The chirping of the jays, the chattering of the squirrels, the buzzing of the insects, it all stopped. At once. The only sounds left were the thud of my own heart against my ribs and the soft crunch of fallen leaves under my boots. The silence was so absolute, so profound, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. It was a dead, sterile quiet, utterly alien to a living forest. The air grew heavy, still, and cold. That's when I saw it. To my left, just a few feet off the barely there trail. It was nestled in the moss between the gnarled roots of a cedar tree so old its bark looked like wrinkled stone. It was a small object, carved from a piece of dark, almost black wood. I leaned in, my curiosity overriding my unease. It was a bird, whittled into the shape of a bird in mid-flight. But it was wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. The craftsmanship was exquisite, impossibly detailed. Every feather was defined, but the anatomy was a study in unnatural design. The bird's wings were bent back at an angle that would have shattered the bones of any living creature. Its neck was craned upwards, its beak open not in song, but in what could only be interpreted as a silent, wooden scream of agony. It was a sculpture of beautiful, perfect wrongness. Against my better judgment, I reached out and picked it up. The wood was shockingly heavy and cool to the touch, despite the humid air. It was smooth, polished by time or by hands, and it felt ancient. There was no dust on it, no speck of moss, no sign of weathering, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. The instant my fingers closed around it, two things happened simultaneously. First, a wave of intense, crippling vertigo washed over me. The world seemed to lurch and tilt, the massive cedars swaying like blades of grass in a gale, though there wasn't a breath of wind. My stomach churned. Second, a low hum began to vibrate up through the soles of my boots. It was a sound so deep and resonant it was felt more than heard, a bass note that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the earth. It thrummed in my bones, in my teeth. Panic, pure and primal, seized me. I dropped the carving as if it had seared my flesh. It hit the mossy ground with a soft, dull thud. The moment it left my hand, the world snapped back into its proper alignment. The humming ceased. The vertigo vanished. The oppressive weight on my eardrums lifted. And slowly, tentatively, the sounds of the forest returned. First, the chirp of a lone cricket. Then the distant, cawing cry of a crow. The feeling of being watched, while not gone entirely, receded to the back of my mind. I was left trembling, a cold sweat plastering my shirt to my back, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. I stared at the little wooden effigy of agony lying in the moss. I didn't dare touch it again. A voice in the deepest, most primitive part of my brain screamed one word at me. Leave. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the carving. Then I turned and half-walked, half-stumbled back the way I came, not caring about the trapper, not caring about my patrol. My only goal was the safety of the known trail, the comfort of a man-made path. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, well after dark. I drove back to the station in a state of agitated confusion. The image of that bird burned into my mind. The next morning, I found Dale brewing coffee in the station kitchen. I tried to sound casual, but my voice was tight. Dale, I said, saw something weird yesterday, up in the north sector. He didn't turn around. He just kept stirring the coffee. Yeah. I described the event in as much detail as I could muster. The sudden silence, the feeling of being observed, and the carving. I described the impossible angle of its wings, the silent scream, the heavy, dark wood. When I finished, Dale stopped stirring. He put the spoon down with a soft click. He turned around and looked at me, and his face was pale, his eyes dark with a gravity I had never seen before. He motioned with his head toward the back door. Let's take a walk. We went outside, into the crisp morning air. He led me away from the station, toward the line of trees, away from the ears of the younger, greener rangers. He didn't speak until we were out of sight. Describe it again, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I did. I told him about the humming, the dizziness, the feeling that the world was tilting on its axis. He listened without a single interruption, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the forest. When I was done, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. You found a marker, he said, the words heavy with significance. A territorial sign. A sign for what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The trapper. Dale finally looked at me, his eyes locking onto mine. No, son, he said, and the weariness of 30 years was in his voice. Not for the trapper. It was a warning. For you. You were too far in. You were off the path. You crossed a line you didn't know existed. They were letting you know. A cold dread, colder than any mountain stream, trickled down my spine. They? I asked. Who is they? Dale looked over his shoulder, a subconscious gesture of caution, before leaning in closer. The smell of tobacco and pine was on his breath. His voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper, a secret passed from one generation of watcher to the next. The keepers, he said, the ones who were here before the park, before the roads, before us. They're the ones who really run this place. And you just knocked on their front door. The name hung in the air between Dale and me, heavy and cold with unspoken history. The keepers. After that day, a profound shift occurred in my perception of the world. The veil of my romanticism had not just been lifted. It had been torn away, leaving behind a stark and unsettling reality. Dale wouldn't say much more, and I knew better than to press him. Men like Dale didn't share secrets. They allowed you to stumble upon the truth and hoped you were wise enough to understand. His only parting advice that day was a quiet, almost paternal plea. Be careful, Art. Respect the boundaries, not the ones on the map, the real ones. I began to see the park through new eyes. It was no longer a simple sanctuary. It was a territory, a domain governed by forces I couldn't comprehend. I started listening more intently to the whispers in the station, cross-referencing the official, sanitized reports of missing persons with the hushed, unofficial accounts shared by the veterans. My mind, now primed by my own experience, began to connect the dots, and a chilling pattern emerged from the static of random accidents. The disappearances, the ones that were truly inexplicable, almost always involved individuals who had displayed a flagrant disrespect for the park. Not simple mistakes like forgetting to pack extra socks. These were acts of deep-seated arrogance, acts of vandalism, of cruelty, of a profound and willful ignorance of the wilderness's sanctity. I vividly remember the file on 3 college students from a few years prior. They had been reported by other hikers for being loud, drunk, and obnoxious. But their cardinal sin was carving their initials and fraternity letters deep into the face of a sacred petroglyph panel. A rock face covered in art left by indigenous people 1,000 years ago. They defaced history for a cheap laugh. The ranger who confronted them said they were belligerent, claiming their tuition money paid his salary and they could do as they pleased. They were last seen hiking toward a treacherous ridge, boasting they were going to find a real view, away from the tourists. They vanished. Not a trace was ever found. The official report cited inexperience and probable exposure. But Dale, when I asked him about it, just shook his head and muttered, "You don't carve your name into a church wall." Then there was the case of a wealthy businessman from out of state, a man known in hunting circles for his ethically questionable practices. He had a permit for elk, but rumor was he was illegally baiting bears, using pastries and rotting meat to lure them in for an easy, unsporting kill. He was a man who saw the wilderness not as a living entity, but as a backdrop for his ego. He went into a remote basin in the western sector, a place known for its thick woods and grisly population. He never came out. A search party found his high-powered, custom-engraved rifle leaning pristine against a tree, a full magazine, the safety on. His expensive tent was nearby, fully stocked. But the man himself was gone. A predator attack was the official conclusion. But as Hicks, the veteran ranger, pointed out over a beer, no bear in this park is going to kill a man and leave a perfectly good rifle behind. They just cleaned up a mess, is all. Cleaned up a mess. Tidied up. The park's immune system. Dale's words echoed in my head. I came to believe the keepers were not malicious, not in the human sense. They were more like a force of nature, as impersonal as an avalanche or a lightning strike. They acted with a cold, detached sense of purpose, to identify and remove anything that threatened the health and balance of their domain. They were the antibodies to the infection of human arrogance. This horrifying new understanding was my constant companion for 2 years. I became more cautious, more observant. I looked for the subtle signs Dale had alluded to. I treated every patrol into the deep backcountry with the gravity of entering a foreign country with strict, unspoken customs laws. But this knowledge was still abstract, a framework built on old stories and my own single strange encounter. It wasn't until the high summer of 1985 that I would truly understand the methods, the chilling intelligence, and the sheer alien nature of the keepers. It began, as these things so often do, with the sound of a mother's scream. The call came over the radio on a brilliant, cloudless July afternoon. The park was sweltering, packed to the gills with summer vacationers. The air was thick with the smell of hot pine needles, barbecue smoke, and sunscreen. I was at the main station, processing paperwork, when the dispatcher's voice cut through the mundane chatter, sharp and laced with adrenaline. All units in the Sunken Meadow district, we have a report of a missing child. 6-year-old male, name is Daniel Peterson, blonde hair, blue shirt, red shorts. Last seen near the Lakeside Trail approximately 20 minutes ago. A missing child. There is no call that sends a colder spike of dread through a ranger's heart. An adult can be foolish, can be prepared, can make choices. A child is simply vulnerable. The protocol is immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the park's atmosphere shifted from one of leisurely recreation to one of focused, frantic crisis. Sunken Meadow was considered one of the safest, most family-friendly areas in the entire park. It was a gentle, bowl-shaped valley with a placid, crystal-clear lake at its center. A wide, well-maintained gravel trail, no more than a mile long, circled the lake. The woods around it were picturesque, not menacing. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their kids run a few yards ahead on the trail. It was unthinkable that a child could get truly lost there. By the time I arrived, the scene was already one of controlled chaos. Rangers were establishing a perimeter. Volunteers, wide-eyed tourists shocked out of their vacation stupor, were being organized into search lines. I found Danny's parents. They were young, their faces pale masks of terror. The mother was weeping uncontrollably, while the father stood rigid, trying to answer a senior ranger's questions, his voice cracking with each word. The story was terrifyingly simple. Danny had been playing hide-and-seek with his 9-year-old brother. He'd run behind a large cluster of ferns just off the trail. When his brother counted to 20 and went to find him, Danny was gone. He had simply vanished from a 20-foot stretch of trail in the middle of a bright, sunny afternoon. We began the search in earnest. We swept the area in methodical grid patterns, our voices calling his name over and over. Danny! Danny! The sound echoed across the placid lake, a desperate mantra against the indifferent beauty of the day. We searched the woods bordering the trail. We checked the public restrooms, the picnic areas. We had rangers wade into the shallow parts of the lake, probing the reeds. The sun beat down on us. Hours passed. The hope on the parents' faces began to curdle into a gray, abject despair. By nightfall, the search area had expanded. We had teams with search dogs, night vision equipment, and floodlights. The mood had grown grim. A 6-year-old alone in the woods after dark, the odds shrink with every passing minute. We were now looking for a body. I was assigned to a 3-man team tasked with sweeping a steep, wooded ridge that overlooked the entire Sunken Meadow Valley. It was difficult terrain, a tangle of rhododendron thickets and loose shale, far too challenging for a small child to have possibly climbed. Our assignment was one of due diligence, of eliminating even the most improbable possibilities. My teammates were 2 younger rangers, both good men, but both knew enough to still believe that every mystery in the woods had a rational, textbook explanation. We moved slowly up the ridge, the beams of our powerful flashlights cutting cones of white light into the oppressive, ink-black darkness. The air was cool now, and the forest was alive with the normal sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small things in the undergrowth. The chatter on our radios was constant, a lifeline connecting the scattered search teams. And then it happened. Just as it had 2 years prior, the world went silent. It was as if a giant, cosmic hand had descended and snuffed out every sound. The crickets stopped. The owl went quiet. The rustling ceased. It was a dead, profound, an absolute silence that swallowed the night. My radio, which had been crackling with a fellow ranger's voice a second before, hissed into a blanket of pure, white noise static. I froze, my blood running cold. I knew this silence. It was a herald. "Hey, you guys getting this?" One of the young rangers, a kid named Mark, asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden void. He tapped his radio. "My signal's gone." "Mine too," said the other, Ben. I didn't answer. I was listening, waiting. A deep, primal part of me knew what was coming. And then we heard it. It started as a faint sound, drifting up from the valley floor below. It was a voice, a child's voice. "Mummy!" Mark and Ben gasped with relief. "That's him," Mark yelled, grabbing his radio again. "Command. This is Ridge Team 4. We have audible contact." He was met with only static. But I felt no relief. I felt a wave of terror so profound it almost buckled my knees. Because the voice was wrong. It was Danny's voice, yes. The pitch, the timbre was a perfect match. But it was also not. There was no desperation in it. No fear. No breath. It was a hollow, flat, and chillingly perfect imitation of the sound, but completely devoid of the human emotion that should have been behind it. It was like hearing a voice from a recording played through a broken, tinny speaker, a phantom sound hanging in the dead air. The voice stretched the vowel, turning it into something unnatural and predatory. "Moo-me," it called out again from a slightly different location, 100 yards to the left of the first call. It was moving. "Danny!" Ben shouted into the darkness. "Keep calling, buddy. We're coming to get you." He took a step forward, ready to plunge down the treacherous slope. A cold dread seized me, and I grabbed his arm, my grip like a vice. "Quiet," I hissed, my voice a strained whisper. "Both of you, be quiet, and don't move." They turned to me, their faces a mixture of confusion and indignation in the beams of our flashlights. "What are you talking about, Art?" Mark demanded. "That's him. We have to get to him." "No," I said, my own voice trembling slightly. I stared into the blackness of the valley, where the phantom voice now called again, this time from further to the right. "That's not him. That's an echo. It's a lure." "A lure? What are you talking about?" Ben shot back. "What would be luring us?" How could I explain? How could I tell these two rational, well-trained young men that the forest itself was playing a trick on us? That an ancient, faceless intelligence was using a lost child's voice as bait? "Listen to it," I urged them, my voice low and intense. "Really listen. Is that how a scared kid sounds? Where's the panic? Where's the breath between his cries? It's just a sound. It's a recording." They fell silent, their bravado giving way to a creeping unease as they listened. The voice called again. "Help me, I'm lost." This time it sounded like it came from directly below us, in a tangle of fallen logs and rocks where a fall would mean a broken leg at best. It was a perfect trap. It was designed to prey on our instincts, on our duty, on our humanity. It wanted us to rush headlong and blind into the darkness. We stood frozen on that ridge for what felt like an eternity, caught in the grip of that profound, unnatural silence, prisoners of a phantom voice. It played its game with us, its calls echoing from different points in the valley, a cruel and intelligent puppeteer pulling at our strings. It was demonstrating its ability to manipulate us, to control our perception of reality. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The phantom voice vanished, and the silence it left behind was somehow even more terrifying. A moment later, a cacophony of sound erupted as the natural world switched back on. The crickets resumed their chorus, so loud it was startling, and my radio crackled, hissed, and then burst to life with the frantic voice of the search commander. All units, stand by, we have a visual. The boy has been found. I repeat, the boy has been found." A wave of relief and utter confusion washed over my two young partners. But for me, it was a moment of sickening confirmation. The commander's voice continued, clear as day. "He's at the south end of the lake, right by the trailhead. He appears to be unharmed, right back where he started." Later that night, back at the command post, I heard the full story. A ranger making one last sweep of the main trail had found Danny standing at the edge of the woods, staring out at the lake. His clothes were damp and covered in leaves, but he was physically fine. When his hysterical parents embraced him, he was strangely quiet, almost docile. And then he told his story. A story that was immediately dismissed by the authorities as the product of fear and an overactive imagination, but a story that confirmed every terrible suspicion I had. He said he hadn't been lost. He said when he hid behind the ferns, a tall, quiet man had been there waiting. He said the man put a long finger to where his mouth should have been, a gesture for silence. The man, Danny said, took his hand. His hand was cold like a river stone. He wasn't scared, he said, because the man wasn't scary. He was just quiet. The man, he explained to the debriefing psychologist, had no face. When asked to clarify, the boy grew frustrated. "It was just smooth," he repeated, over and over. "Like an egg. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. He didn't talk with his mouth." "How did he talk, then?" "He made sounds in his throat," Danny whispered. like clicking pebbles together, a soft, wet sound. The boy said the faceless man led him away from the trail, deep into the woods. He walked for a long, long time. It didn't feel dark, he said, even though it was night. The man just pointed the way, and Danny followed. Finally, the man led him back to the edge of the trees, pointed toward the lights of the search party by the lake, and then, as Danny put it, he just melted back into the trees. Like a shadow. The official report was filed. Child wandered off, experienced mild exposure and disorientation, and luckily found his own way back. His fantastical story was a footnote, a trauma response. But I knew better. They had taken him, the keepers, and for a reason I could only guess at, they had brought him back. Perhaps the boy was innocent. His crime of wandering off the trail not serious enough to warrant their ultimate, permanent form of tidying up. Perhaps the entire thing, the disappearance, the phantom voice, the safe return, was something else. It was a message, a demonstration of power directed at us, the rangers, the searchers. It was the keepers reminding us who held the real authority here. We can take anyone from anywhere at any time, the act seemed to say. We can lead you on a fool's errand with nothing but an echo. This domain is ours, not yours. Remember your place. I never looked at a missing persons case the same way again. The wilderness was no longer a beautiful, indifferent force. I now knew it had a consciousness. It had sentinels. And they were always watching. After the incident in Sunken Meadow, the incident I now refer to in my mind as the echo in the valley, me fear of the keepers underwent a strange and dangerous alchemy. The raw, primal terror was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but it was now mingled with something else, something far more perilous. A consuming, obsessive curiosity. The fear had not paralyzed me. Instead, it had sharpened my focus. I had to understand. It was no longer enough to hear the second-hand stories or to have my own fleeting, terrifying encounters. I felt a desperate, intellectual need to quantify the threat, to learn the rules of this silent, invisible kingdom that existed just beyond the edges of my own. I convinced myself that this pursuit was a matter of professional diligence, a way to better protect my fellow rangers and the public. But if I am to be honest, as I must be in this final telling, the motive was far more selfish. I had looked into a crack in the veneer of reality, and I could not, for the life of me, look away. That fall, I went to a pawn shop in a town 50 miles from the park and purchased a used 35mm camera with a powerful zoom lens and a half-dozen leather-bound, pocket-sized notebooks. I kept them hidden in a locked footlocker under my bed at the ranger barracks. This was my private crusade, a secret investigation I shared with no one, not even Dale. He had given me the key. I felt a grim certainty that he would not approve of me trying to unlock the door. My patrols became twofold missions. On the surface, I was Ranger Arthur Coleman, performing my duties. But beneath that, I was an ethnographer of the unknown, a cartographer of fear. I started paying meticulous attention to the subtle anomalies of the forest, the things a casual hiker or even a less attentive ranger would walk past without a second glance. And once I knew what to look for, I began to see their language written everywhere. It was a language of stone, wood, and bone. The most common markings, the simplest to find, were the stones. You would be hiking a faint game trail miles from any designated human path, and you would see it. A small stack of 3, sometimes 4, perfectly flat river stones, placed one on top of the other on a mossy log or a prominent boulder. They were always balanced with an unnatural precision. They were not the clumsy, leaning towers a bored hiker might build. These were perfectly centered, defying the subtle inclines and textures of where they sat. They felt deliberate. Finding one always brought on that same low-level prickle of being watched. I photographed every one. In my notebook, I theorized that these were the most benign of the signs. A simple declaration of presence. A signpost. We use this path. We are here. The second type of marking was more unsettling. It was the one that truly began to delineate their territory. I would find them on the bark of ancient, powerful trees, oaks, cedars, and Douglas firs. Always on the side facing away from the nearest human trail, sometimes a half-mile or more into the deep woods. They were a series of deep, parallel scratches in the bark. At first glance, one might assume it was a bear sharpening its claws. But a closer look revealed the fallacy of that assumption. I remember the first one I found. It was on a massive fir tree whose trunk was as wide as my outstretched arms. For parallel grooves, each about 2 feet long, were gouged into the thick bark. I ran my fingers over them. A bear's claws are curved and of varying lengths. They leave messy, arcing gouges. These were perfectly straight, perfectly parallel, and of a uniform depth, as if carved with a 4-pronged industrial rake. The bottom of the grooves was smooth, not torn. I knelt down and smelled the fresh sap oozing from the wounds. It was recent. As I stayed there, crouched in the silent woods, I felt a distinct sense of transgression, as if I had just read a page from someone's private diary. This wasn't a sign of presence. This felt like a warning, a line drawn in the sand. This is our boundary. Do not cross. But the third type of marking, the third type, was the one that spoke of absolute ownership and lethal consequence. The third type was the one that taught me true visceral fear. These were the bone lattices. I had pushed deeper than ever before into a sector known as the Blackwood Basin. It was a primordial place, full of swamps and ancient trees draped in moss. A place that felt like it had slept undisturbed for 10,000 years. I was feeling confident, perhaps even arrogant. I had my notebook, my camera. I thought I was beginning to understand. I was following a series of the tree scratch markings, thinking I was mapping their outer perimeter. The scratches led me to the edge of a stagnant, black water creek. And there, hanging from the low branch of a skeletal-looking willow tree, was the thing that stopped my heart. It was a wind chime from a nightmare. It was a complex, intricate lattice, perhaps 2 feet wide, woven from the tiny, delicate bones of small animals, the ribs of squirrels, the skulls of birds, the femurs of rabbits. They were lashed together with what looked like dried, reddish-brown sinew. It spun slowly in the almost imperceptible breeze, the tiny bones clattering against each other with a soft, dry, rattling sound. It was a piece of art, terrifying and beautiful in its macabre intricacy, and it was placed with unmistakable purpose, directly over the only safe crossing point of the creek. It was a gate. I stood there, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck. The arrogance drained out of me, replaced by a cold, liquid dread. This was not a warning. This was a statement. A final, unambiguous declaration. This place belongs to us. What is beyond this point is not for you. Turn back or you will be unmade. You will be disassembled and woven into our next creation. I did not need my notebook to interpret that meaning. I felt it in my marrow. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the softly rattling bones. And I did not stop walking until the dark water and the willow tree were far behind me. I learned to read their signs. A stack of stones meant caution. A set of scratches meant danger. A bone lattice meant turn back immediately, for your life. On 2 separate occasions after that day, I encountered another bone lattice, and both times I abandoned my patrol without a second thought, my heart hammering against my ribs. My obsession demanded more than just my own findings. I needed corroboration. I began to seek out the other old-timers, the grizzled veterans of the Park Service and the Forest Service, men nearing retirement who I suspected might have seen things. Most, when I'd cautiously broach the subject over a coffee or a beer, would clam up. Their eyes would glaze over with a familiar, haunted look, and they'd change the subject. They had seen enough to know that speaking of it gave it power. But a few knew. At a regional training conference in Oregon, I fell into conversation with a man named Frank, a ranger with 35 years of experience in Olympic National Park. After a few drinks, I carefully described one of the tree markings. He went quiet, staring into his glass for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "The Watchers," he said, his voice low. He told me he'd never seen a bone lattice, but he'd found their shelters. He described stumbling upon a structure woven from living saplings and thick moss, so perfectly integrated into the forest floor that he nearly stepped on it. He said it was just large enough for 2 or 3 beings to curl up inside. There was no fire pit, no tools, no trash, no sign of human or animal life, just the shelter, and what he described as a profound and palpable aura of wrongness. He said he felt like a trespasser in a holy and hostile place. Another time, I spoke with a retired Forest Service patrolman named Jim, who had worked in the vast, remote wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains. He called them the Silent Ones. Jim's story was different. He had never seen them or their markings. He had heard them. He described being deep in a valley, miles from anyone, when the forest would come alive with whispers. But it wasn't a human language. He described it as a disorienting symphony of clicks, soft whistles, and low, guttural hums. He said it sounded like the forest itself had gained a voice, and that the sounds seemed to come from all directions at once, impossible to pinpoint. It was a form of communication, he was sure of it, and it made him feel utterly alien, like an intruder in his own skin. These conversations solidified a terrifying truth in my mind. This wasn't a local legend. This wasn't some isolated tribe in my park. They were everywhere. The Watchers, the Silent Ones, the Keepers. Whatever the name, the phenomenon was the same. They were a fundamental, continental component of the wilderness. They were not feral humans. They were something else entirely. Something ancient and something that valued its privacy above all else. This knowledge should have made me more cautious. Instead, it fanned the flames of my obsession. I had the what, but I didn't have the who or the why. I became reckless. I started to believe that because I could read their signs, I was somehow exempt from their rules. I thought I could be a neutral observer, a naturalist studying a new species. It was the hubris that so often precedes a fall. And my fall came in the late autumn of my 10th year, in a place the old prospectors had called the Labyrinth of Sorrows. It wasn't a name on any official park map. It was a local moniker for a maze of deep, narrow slot canyons and jagged, monolithic rock formations in the park's far eastern sector. It was notoriously easy to get lost in, a place where compasses spun erratically due to high concentrations of iron ore in the rock. It was a place rangers were explicitly told to avoid patrolling alone. I had determined, the heart of their territory. I was tracking a new kind of marking I'd never seen before, a complex symbol, like a broken circle with a line through it, scratched into the rock faces. The trail of symbols led me deeper and deeper into the labyrinth. I was so focused on the next clue, on the thrill of the hunt, that I failed to pay proper attention to the most powerful force in the mountains: the weather. The change was brutally swift. The sky, a brilliant, crystalline blue just an hour before, turned a dark, bruised purple. The temperature plummeted as if a freezer door had been thrown open. A savage wind began to howl through the canyons, and then the snow began. It wasn't the gentle, picturesque snowfall of a Christmas card. It was a thick, wet, blinding curtain of white, driven horizontally by the gale. Within 15 minutes, I was utterly, hopelessly lost. My tracks were gone. The symbols I was following were invisible beneath a growing blanket of white. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun in a drunken circle. I reached for my GPS, a new piece of gear I was testing, but the screen was dead, its battery instantly drained by the ferocious cold. I was alone, miles from any trail, in the heart of a blizzard, in the center of their world. I stumbled for hours, calling out on my radio with no response, the wind snatching the words from my mouth. The snow deepened, first to my ankles, then my knees. Hypothermia, the quiet killer of the mountains, began its insidious work. My movements became sluggish, my thoughts thick and slow. A deadly, deceptive warmth began to spread through my core as my body gave up its fight to stay warm. I knew the signs. I knew I was dying. Finally, my legs would carry me no further. I collapsed at the base of a massive rock overhang, a pitifully small shelter against the storm's fury. I curled into a fetal position, the blowing snow quickly burying me. I was too exhausted to shiver. I closed my eyes, a strange sense of peace washing over me. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, but as a fool who had pushed his luck too far, frozen solid in a monument to his own obsession. As my consciousness began to fray, slipping into that final, peaceful darkness, I saw them. They did not walk out of the blizzard. They seemed to resolve out of it, like figures coalescing from the static of the storm itself. 3 of them. They were just as the lost boy, Danny, had described, yet so much more terrible in person. They were impossibly tall and slender, their limbs elongated to a degree that felt fundamentally wrong. They wore no clothes, their pale, bone-white skin seemingly impervious to the raging cold. And their faces. The boy was right. They had no faces, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, gently curved, and utterly blank canvas of skin, like a sculpture worn smooth by millennia of wind and rain. And yet I felt their gaze. I felt a dispassionate, ancient, and unervingly intelligent curiosity emanating from those blank visages as they stood over me. This small, dying creature, a piece of trash littered in their home. There was no malice, no anger, no emotion I could name, just a quiet, piercing appraisal. They moved with a grace that defied the laws of physics, their long, thin feet making no sound on the snow. They communicated with each other, not with whispers, but with a series of slow, deliberate hand gestures and the soft, wet, clicking sounds that Danny had described, a sound like pebbles being dropped one by one into a deep well. One of them knelt beside me. It moved with the fluidity of smoke. It reached out a long, slender hand, a hand with 3 fingers and a thumb, all of them unnaturally long. I flinched, bracing for a blow, for a final, merciful end. But it did not touch me. It simply hovered its palm a few inches above my chest. A strange, penetrating warmth bloomed in my core, pushing back the deadly cold. My shivering started again, violently. My mind, which had been foggy and slow, snapped into a state of horrified clarity. They were not saving me. I understood that with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty. They were studying me. They were observing the process of a human system failing, analyzing my biology with the detached interest a scientist affords a specimen on a slide. The kneeling one tilted its blank head, a gesture of inquiry. And then, from somewhere within its smooth, featureless form, a sound emerged. It was a perfect, lossless recording of my own voice, from a radio call I had made that very morning. Coleman to base. My own voice echoed flatly in the howling wind. All clear in Sector 4. Weather looks good. Should be back by 1800. It was a playback. Perfect mimicry. A demonstration. They were showing me they had been listening. Always. They were showing me they knew who I was, and that my presence here was no accident. Then, as one, they stood. Another of the keepers pointed a long, delicate finger toward a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock wall to my right, a gap I had not seen. The first one retracted its hand, and the biting, lethal cold flooded back into me instantly, a stark reminder of my mortality. They turned, and without a sound, walked back into the white chaos of the blizzard, dissolving into the snow as if they had never been. I lay there, trembling from cold and from a terror so profound it felt like a religious experience. I knew what the gesture meant. It was not an act of mercy. It was a choice, a test. They had shown me a path. Now it was up to me to have the strength to take it. They were not my saviors. They were my judges. Fueled by a terror more potent than any adrenaline, I began to crawl. I crawled on hands and knees through the deepening snow, my frozen limbs screaming, toward that narrow gap. It led, as they knew it would, into a small, sheltered canyon, protected from the wind. And from the far end of that canyon, through the swirling snow, I could just make out a familiar ridgeline. A way home. Took me the entire night to fight my way back to my truck. Every step was an agony of will. But I was not driven by the hope of survival. I was driven by the image of those 3 blank faces, by the sound of my own voice thrown back at me, by the absolute soul-shattering knowledge of what lived in the heart of the park. My foolish quest for knowledge was over. I had seen the keepers. I had looked upon the true masters of the wilderness, and I knew with every fiber of my being that I was, and always had been, nothing more than a guest who had just been forcefully reminded of the house rules. The man who staggered out of the labyrinth of sorrows was not the same man who had eagerly walked into it. I had survived, but survival is a complicated word. My body had survived. I was treated for severe frostbite and exposure, and after a week, the doctors cleared me for duty. But the person I had been, the obsessive investigator, the arrogant intellectual, the man who believed he could map the contours of a mystery without being consumed by it, Hat Man, died in the blizzard. He was frozen solid somewhere back in that silent, white canyon, and a stranger looked out from my eyes in the mirror. My official report was a masterpiece of creative omission, the most profound lie I ever committed to paper. I wrote that I had been caught unprepared by the storm's ferocity, a rookie mistake from a veteran who should have known better. I wrote that my equipment failed, that I became disoriented, and that I stumbled by sheer, dumb luck into a sheltered canyon that protected me from the worst of the wind. I wrote that I had hunkered down and waited for a break in the storm before navigating my way out. It was a plausible story. It was the story everyone wanted to hear. Painted me as a man humbled by nature, not by something unnatural. My secret footlocker, the one with my notebooks and camera, became a tomb. I took it out one night, unlocked it, and looked at its contents. The notebooks filled with my meticulous, almost fanatical documentation. The photographs of the stacked stones, the claw-like scratches on the trees, the chilling shot of the bone lattice. They were no longer trophies of a bold investigation. They were artifacts of a profound and unforgivably foolish trespass. They were the evidence of my hubris. I saw them not as data, but as a collection of invitations, each one a knock on a door that should never, ever have been opened. I closed the lid, locked it, and shoved it deep into the back of a closet, a sarcophagus for the man I used to be. The price of knowing was the absolute certainty that I never wanted to know anymore. That certainty reshaped my entire existence as a ranger. My career, once a source of adventure and discovery, became an exercise in managed terror. The fear was no longer a thrilling spike of adrenaline in a strange situation. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my days. It was the tinnitus of my soul. I stopped volunteering for deep backcountry patrols. I stopped exploring the faint game trails. I became a creature of the marked path, a zealot for the very boundaries I had once so eagerly crossed. This change was not lost on my colleagues, especially the new generation of rangers, the bright-eyed idealists who reminded me so painfully of my younger self. They saw me as overly cautious at best, and a grumpy, burned-out old man at worst. I would deny backcountry permits for solo hikers heading into certain areas, citing vague concerns about unpredictable conditions, earning me their scorn. I would drill them relentlessly on trail etiquette, on packing out every single scrap of trash, on never, ever feeding the wildlife. My insistence bordered on the fanatical. Art, it's just one guy leaving an apple core. A young ranger once told me, laughing. The squirrels will get it. What's the big deal? I turned on him, my voice colder than I intended. The big deal, I said, my words low and intense, is that the rules are not for the squirrels. They're for us. The trails, the regulations, the designated campsites, they aren't just suggestions for having a pleasant visit. They are a pact. They are a treaty of non-aggression we have signed with this place. You break the treaty, the other side is no longer bound by it. You leave your apple core. You carve your initials. You take a shortcut through the woods. You think they're small things, but you're chipping away at the foundation of our safety here. You are drawing attention. And trust me, son, the last thing you ever want in these woods is to be noticed. He just stared at me, bewildered, as if I were a madman. He couldn't understand. How could he? I was a man living in a world he couldn't see. I looked at the familiar, beautiful landscapes of the park, and I no longer saw just mountains and trees. I saw borders. I saw territories. I saw a delicate, invisible lacework of lines and agreements, and I saw the immense, silent, patient power that patrolled those lines. The price of knowing was a profound and unshakable loneliness. I was surrounded by people, yet I was utterly alone in my reality. I was never again a direct target of the keepers. I obeyed the rules. I became, in my own way, invisible to them, but I saw their work. I learned to recognize the aftermath of their housekeeping. The final, most vivid lesson occurred in the high summer of my 20th year of service, long after I had accepted my new, fearful role in the park's ecosystem. A group of 4 men, wealthy tech entrepreneurs in their late 20s, had rented the most expensive cabins at the park lodge. From the moment they arrived, they were a problem. They treated the park not as a natural wonder to be respected, but as their personal playground, a backdrop for their loud, alcohol-fueled egos. They were cited for flying a drone in a restricted wilderness area, its loud buzzing scattering a herd of elk. They were warned for blaring electronic music from speakers at a scenic viewpoint, shattering the peace for everyone else. They were caught by another ranger trying to corner a young deer to get a killer selfie with it. With every warning, they were arrogant, dismissive, and condescending. They laughed in our faces, making jokes about how our salaries were paid for by their taxes. They were the epitome of the kind of infection the park's immune system was designed to fight. The final straw came on a Tuesday. The river that flowed through the main valley was running dangerously high and fast after a week of heavy rain up in the mountains. We had posted warning signs everywhere. All rafting and kayaking were strictly prohibited. The water was a churning, brown torrent filled with debris. It was a death trap. That afternoon, we got a call that this group had been seen inflating a cheap, store-bought raft and putting it in the water, laughing and high-fiving as they were swept away by the current. They had been directly warned by a ranger at the put-in spot, and they had reportedly told him to mind his own business. They were seeking a thrill. They had no idea what they were inviting. A search, of course, was launched, but it was a formality. No one could survive that river in that raft. 3 days later, a patrol team found their empty raft, torn and shredded, snagged on a logjam 10 miles downstream. It was my team that found it. The official cause for all 4 men would be accidental drowning, their bodies likely swept away and lost forever in the violent current. It was a tragic but entirely predictable outcome. But as my team documented the scene, I felt that old, familiar chill run down my spine, that feeling of a deeper truth lying just beneath the surface. I left the others and walked along the riverbank, scanning the tree line. And then I saw it. About 50 yards upstream from the wrecked raft, well above the high water mark, on a large, flat, sun-bleached rock, was a small, neat pile. I walked over to it, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. On the rock sat 4 expensive leather wallets, brimming with cash and credit cards. Next to them were 2 sets of car keys and 2 high-end smartphones. Everything was perfectly dry. It was placed with the same eerie, meticulous tidiness as Klaus Richter's folded clothes. All those years ago, it was a gesture of profound indifference. The keepers had no use for our trinkets, for our symbols of wealth and identity. They had simply removed the problem, and this was the leftover refuse, presented for collection. A courtesy. One of the phones was a newer model, advertised as being waterproof. I picked it up. The screen was black, the battery dead. A younger ranger might have logged it into evidence and forgotten about it. But I knew this was a final puzzle piece, a final communique. I took the phone with me. That night, back in my quiet cabin, I plugged the phone into a charger. Powered on. The screen lit up with a photo of the 4 smiling, arrogant men, arms around each other, giving the camera the middle finger. The photo gallery was full of their vacation. Dozens of videos of them harassing wildlife, laughing at the scenery, and generally behaving like fools. I scrolled to the very last file. It was a video, not a photo. It was only about 30 seconds long. The timestamp was from the afternoon they disappeared. I pressed play. The video was chaotic, shot from the raft itself. The sound was a roar of churning water mixed with their drunken, excited shouts. The camera was pointed erratically, showing glimpses of the violent, brown water, the careening raft, the shoreline flashing past. It was dizzying and chaotic. And then, for about 3 seconds, the camera panned toward the riverbank. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on the shore, partially obscured by the thick foliage, were the figures. There were at least 5 of them, tall, slender, and unervingly still. They were pale against the dark green of the forest, like birch trees that had learned to walk. The video quality was poor, the motion frantic, but there was no mistaking their form. They were simply standing there, watching, bearing silent witness to the unfolding chaos. They were not intervening. They were simply observing. The video ended a few seconds later in a flurry of motion and a final, choked-off scream as the phone was presumably dropped and the raft capsized. I sat there in the silence of my cabin, the phone's glow illuminating my face. This was it. The proof. The kind of evidence I had once dreamed of finding. A blurry, chaotic, but undeniable recording of the keepers in their role as silent judges. I could turn this over. It would cause a sensation. It would be analyzed by experts. It would be debated and debunked and argued over for years. It would draw a spotlight of unwanted, intrusive attention to this place, to their world. I thought of their faceless visages in the blizzard. I thought of the warmth they had pushed into my chest, not to save me, but to study me. I thought of their power, their patience, their utter lack of anything I could recognize as human emotion. Releasing this video would be the ultimate act of disrespect. It would be the equivalent of carving my initials into their sacred house. It would be a profound violation of the treaty. With a trembling finger, I navigated to the phone's menu. I selected the video file, and I deleted it. Then I reset the entire phone to its factory settings, erasing everything. It was not my place to reveal their secrets. The price of knowing was the burden of keeping those secrets. My last years on the job were quiet. The wilderness and I had an understanding. I took a desk assignment training new recruits. I couldn't tell them the full truth, of course. I could not speak of faceless men or phantom voices, but I tried to instill in them the feeling of the truth. I couched it in cautionary tales and practical wisdom. Don't be a hero, I would tell them, looking into their young, confident faces. Don't think you're tougher than the mountain. You're not. Don't think you're smarter than the forest. You're not. Respect the silence. Respect the boundaries. Understand that you are a guest here, and good guests follow the house rules. They would nod and smile, thinking I was just another old ranger with a flair for the dramatic, a man who had spent too many nights alone in the woods. But I pray that for some of them the message sank in. I pray they learned to listen not just with their ears, but with their instincts. I think about the keepers every day. I wonder, were they always there? Or are they a response to us? Are they a planetary immune system, an ancient organic defense mechanism that activates in the presence of a contagion like humanity? They don't hate us. I don't believe they are capable of an emotion as messy and personal as hatred. We are simply, to them, a potential imbalance to be managed. Like a river that floods its banks, or a fire that burns too hot, or a species that grows too numerous. When we stay within our designated channels, when we follow the paths laid out for us, they leave us be. But when we transgress, when we become a blight upon the land, they act. They are silent. They are patient. They are thorough. They are the reason the deepest parts of the wilderness remain wild. They are the reason some secrets are and must always be kept. They aren't the rangers. They are the keepers. And they will be here, moving silently through the ancient forests, long after the last ranger station has crumbled to dust and our maps have faded into nothing. They are the true and eternal wilderness protocol. Part 2. The real reason rangers retire is not because of age. It's because they've seen too much. There's a postcard image of the National Park Ranger. A man or a woman in a crisp uniform and a flat-brimmed hat, smiling benevolently against a backdrop of majestic mountains and towering forests. They are portrayed as stewards, guides, protectors of nature's cathedrals. They are seen as people who have found a way to turn a love of the outdoors into a lifelong career. And when they leave the service, we see another postcard. A gentle, silver-haired figure retiring after 30 or 40 years, ready to enjoy a well-earned pension, full of fond memories of wildlife and sunsets. It's a comforting story, a simple, linear narrative of a life well lived. But like most things you're told about the deep wilderness, that story is a lie. A convenient fiction designed to keep the world orderly and sane. I served as a park ranger for 28 years. I retired a decade before I was eligible for a full pension. My superiors called it early retirement. My family called it a breakdown. My doctor called it chronic stress and anxiety. But the handful of other men I know who left the service the same way, we have a different name for it. We call it the sickness. It's not a sickness of the body. It's a sickness of seeing. The real reason rangers retire is not because of age. It's not the physical toll of hiking countless miles or the emotional toll of search and rescue operations. The real reason the good ones, the ones who spend their lives in the deep backcountry, eventually walk away is because they have seen too much. They have seen something that fundamentally breaks their understanding of the world. Something that proves the laws of physics are negotiable, and that memory is not just something in your head, but something that can linger in the landscape like a stain. Tonight, I'm going to break the unspoken code of silence that we all adhere to. I'm going to tell you what we see, and why, for us, the silence of the city is the only sanctuary left. I pinned on my badge in the late summer of 1978. I was 23 years old, and I saw the world in clean, simple lines of cause and effect. The park, to my young mind, was the ultimate expression of this logic. It was a place of pristine, understandable order. I loved it for its tangible truths: the inexorable grind of a glacier carving a valley, the elegant, brutal efficiency of the food chain, the perfect, closed loop of the water cycle. It was a magnificent, intricate machine, and I believed my job was simply to be a humble mechanic, wandering its corridors and ensuring the visiting public didn't throw a wrench in the gears. I saw a mountain and I saw a billion tons of granite. I saw a river and I saw hydrological dynamics. I saw a forest and I saw a complex symphony of botany. I didn't see anything else, because I hadn't been taught how to look. My first posting was in one of the largest and most remote national parks in the lower 48. My field training officer, my mentor, was a man named Silas. Silas was already an old man then, or seemed so to me. He was a quiet, wiry man, carved from the very wood and rock he patrolled. His skin was leathered by 1,000 suns and 1,000 blizzards. His hands were gnarled and powerful, but it was his eyes that you noticed. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they seemed to hold the vast, empty stillness of the high-altitude lakes. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were chosen with the deliberate care of a man building a stone wall, each one placed just so. Silas taught me the practical arts of a ranger's life, how to read the subtle shift in the wind that foretold a storm, how to distinguish the track of a mountain lion from that of a large dog, how to find water in a dry creek bed by digging where the ferns grew greenest. But he also taught me things that weren't in any manual lessons imparted in his typical, maddeningly oblique way. I remember standing with him on a granite overlook one evening, watching the alpenglow paint the highest peaks in impossible shades of orange and rose. I, in my youthful enthusiasm, said something about the beauty and the peace of it all. Silas didn't answer for a long time. He just stared out at the immense, silent landscape. "It ain't peaceful, kid," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "It's just quiet. There's a difference. Peaceful is a place with no stories. This place is full of them. It remembers things. Most of the time, it keeps those memories to itself. You should hope it stays that way." I thought he was being poetic, spinning a bit of old-timer philosophy. A campfire story without the fire. I would learn, in time, that Silas never spoke poetically. He only ever spoke the truth as he understood it. And his truth was far stranger and more terrifying than I could have ever conceived. My first lesson, my first real glimpse into the sickness, came 2 years into my career. It started, as these things so often do, with a search and rescue. A young man, an ambitious and talented climber from a California university named Ethan Hayes, had gone missing. He was attempting a dangerous, unapproved solo ascent of a formidable peak in the park's central massif, a jagged shard of granite the old prospectors had named the Needle. It was a technical, unforgiving climb, and attempting it alone was arrogant. He was overdue by a day. When the call came, the well-oiled machine of the Park Service sprang into action. We established a command post. Teams were dispatched. We scoured the base of the mountain for any sign of his approach. The weather was clear, which was a blessing for us, but it meant we couldn't blame his disappearance on a storm. For 48 hours we found nothing. The hope that had been a bright flame at the start of the search dwindled to a cold, grim ember. We were no longer looking for a survivor. We were looking for a body. On the third morning, a helicopter crew spotted him. A flash of color from his windbreaker, seen deep within a shadowed crevasse high up on the mountain's unforgiving north face. He had fallen. From that height, there was no question of survival. The mission immediately shifted from rescue to recovery. It was a complex, highly technical operation. The crevasse was deep, and its walls were sheer, unstable ice. It took the park's elite climbing team the better part of the day just to rig the ropes and rappel systems needed to descend safely. Due to the danger and the specialized skills required, most of us were assigned supporting roles. I was stationed at a forward camp, a small staging area we'd set up in a desolate alpine meadow about a mile from the recovery site. It was a lonely, silent place, a flat patch of green surrounded on all sides by a silent jury of gray granite peaks. My job was simple: act as a communications relay between the climbing team and the main command post further down the mountain, as the jagged terrain often blocked direct radio signals. The hours crawled by. I sat on a rock, the radio on my hip crackling intermittently with clipped, professional jargon. Rope 1 is set. Descending now. Watch for falling ice. It was grim, somber work. The sun was warm, but the air at that altitude had a sharp, cold edge. The defining feature of the place was the silence. It was a high, thin silence, broken only by the buzz of my radio and the sound of my own breathing. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the radio crackled again. It was the voice of the recovery team leader, a seasoned climber named Martinez. His voice was tired, professional. "Command, this is Needle Team. We have reached the subject. Confirm he is deceased. We are preparing the rigging for extraction. Stand by." A wave of sad finality washed over me. It was over. The search was done. The radio fell silent. And it was in that moment, in that sudden, profound quiet, that I heard it. It was a man's voice shouting. The sound was distant, but it carried with startling clarity in the thin, still air. "Help! Somebody, help me!" My heart hammered against my ribs. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, shot through me. I leaped to my feet, grabbing my binoculars, scanning the towering rock faces around me. Had we been wrong? Could he have survived the fall and crawled away? Or worse, was there another victim, another climber we didn't know about? I snatched my radio. "This is Coleman at Forward Camp. Command, Needle Team. I have audible contact. I have a voice, shouting for help. Seems to be coming from the northeast of my position." The response from Martinez on the mountain was almost instantaneous. His voice sharp with confusion, cutting through the static. "Negative, Forward Camp. Say again? That's impossible. I am telling you, I hear a voice." I yelled back, my own voice tight with urgency. "He's shouting for help." There was a pause. I could hear Martinez speaking to someone off mic. Then he came back on, his voice firm. "Coleman, we are with the subject. I am looking at him right now. He is deceased. There is no one else up here. You must be mistaken. It's the wind." But it wasn't the wind. As he was speaking, I heard it again, closer this time, seeming to echo from a sheer cliff face where no human could possibly be clinging. "Help! My leg! I think my leg is broken. Oh God! Somebody help!" It was the same voice, young, terrified, and utterly real. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. A cold dread, colder than any glacial ice, began to seep into my bones, chasing away the hot flush of adrenaline. "Martinez, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "He's talking about a broken leg. I am not mistaken. I hear him." There was another pause on the radio, longer this time. When Martinez's voice returned, the professional crispness was gone. It had been replaced by a tone I had never heard from him before. It was a tone of immense weariness, of resignation, of a man who knew something he desperately wished he didn't. "Art," he said, and the fact that he used my first name sent a shiver down my spine. The formal call signs were gone. "Art, listen to me. What you're hearing, it's just the mountain. It gets echoes up here sometimes. It's the rock playing tricks. Do you understand me? Stop logging it. Officially, you are hearing nothing. Over." Before I could respond, the voice cried out one last time. It wasn't words. It was a raw, agonized scream of pain that seemed to go on forever, echoing and multiplying off the granite walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then it faded. The silence that rushed back in was deeper, heavier, and more terrifying than it had been before. I didn't move for an hour. I just stood there on that rock, my hand frozen on my radio, staring at the empty, silent cliffs. The world felt thin, brittle. The team brought Ethan Hayes' body down that evening. It was a solemn, quiet affair. The official report listed the cause of death as massive trauma from the fall. There was no mention of any shouting. My logs for that afternoon were silent on the matter, just as Martinez had ordered. A week later, I was tasked with driving some of Ethan's personal effects, recovered from his car at the trailhead, to his family, who were staying in a motel just outside the park. I met with his father, a gray-faced man hollowed out by grief. I offered him my condolences. He thanked me and we spoke for a few minutes about his son. He told me how much Ethan had loved the mountains, how he had always been pushing his limits. And then he said something that made the cold dread from that meadow return with the force of a physical blow. He was always reckless, ever since he broke his leg so badly a few years back, the father said, his voice thick with sorrow. It was a bad climbing fall. Snapped his femur. The doctors told him he was lucky he didn't lose the leg. I think after that he felt like he had something to prove, like he had to conquer the mountains that had hurt him. I felt my blood turn to ice. My leg. I think my leg is broken. The mountain had not been playing a trick. It hadn't been the wind. It had been playing a recording. It had played back a perfect, high-fidelity echo of a past trauma, a moment of pure agony that had been imprinted on the young man's soul. And the place itself, the silent, ancient rock, had somehow accessed it, broadcasting it like a phantom radio station. When I returned to the ranger station, I found Silas sitting on the porch, cleaning an old rifle. I hesitated for a long time, then I sat down near him. I didn't know how to begin. Finally, I just told him. I described the voice, the words, the scream, and then I told him what the father had said. I expected him to laugh, or to dismiss it as a strange coincidence, or to tell me I was letting the stress of the job get to me. He did none of those things. He just continued his slow, methodical work on the rifle, not looking at me. He waited until I was completely finished. Then he slowly slid a cleaning patch through the barrel, his movements deliberate and calm. "The park has pockets," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Places where things get stuck. You ever see an old piece of magnetic tape? How if you record over it again and again, sometimes in the quiet parts you can hear a ghost of the old recording underneath. The rock is like that, especially old rock like granite. It holds things, and strong feelings, real strong ones, like terror or agony loud. They leave a deep groove on the tape." He finally looked up at me, his pale eyes pinning me in place. "You were in one of those pockets, kid." The boy's end was so loud. Emotionally speaking, it was like a lightning strike. And that strike was so powerful it made an old recording on his own tape jump to the surface. The place got confused, mixed the tapes, played the wrong memory. He went back to cleaning his rifle. That's the first rule of this job, the one they don't write down. You learn that time isn't always a straight line in the deep woods. And you learn that feelings can soak into the ground like rain, And on some days, for reasons nobody understands, the rocks can wring him out again. You didn't just find a body in that crevasse. You found the ghost of his pain. I left him there on the porch and went inside, my world permanently tilted on its axis. The park was no longer a beautiful, logical machine. I now knew that it had a dark, unlit basement, full of broken memories and weeping ghosts. And I had just been given the key. That was my first real step on the long, dark road to seeing too much. For years after I heard Ethan Hayes' phantom scream in that high, lonely meadow, I tried to build a wall of logic around the memory. It was a formidable wall, plastered with rational explanations and scientific terminology. I told myself it was auditory pareidolia brain, under stress, creating a pattern of speech from the random noise of the wind whistling over the granite cliffs. I told myself it was a complex acoustic echo, a freak phenomenon of the valley's topography. I told myself it was a simple, stress-induced hallucination, a brain starved of oxygen at high altitude playing tricks on itself. I clung to these explanations like a drowning man to a splintered piece of driftwood. They allowed me to continue my work, to believe in the solid, dependable world of cause and effect that a ranger must inhabit to stay sane. But the wilderness is patient. It has a way of relentlessly, and without malice, dismantling the walls you build. It just waits. And eventually you see something else that doesn't fit, another crack in the foundation of your reality. And then another, and another, until you are left standing in the ruins of your own certainty. As I gained seniority and a reputation for being thorough or perhaps just quietly obsessive, I began to be assigned as the lead investigator for some of the park's more unusual cases. These weren't just standard search and rescues. They were the strange ones, the events that defied easy categorization, the incidents that the Park Service, in its quiet, bureaucratic way, preferred to file away and forget. It was during this time that I started compiling what we old-timers called the gray files. These weren't official documents. They were my own private collection of stories, of witness accounts, of events shared ranger to ranger in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee late at night. They were the stories that could never be put in an official report because they were, by any rational measure, impossible. They were the data points of the sickness. One of the most famous and persistent gray files, a story that had been circulating among the veterans for a generation before I even arrived, was the account of the staircase man. It wasn't a single event, but a series of sightings, a recurring anomaly reported by at least a dozen different credible witnesses over a span of 30 years. The witnesses were not prone to fantasy. They were people like us, rangers on patrol, seasoned geologists conducting surveys, even a pair of grizzled, no-nonsense hunters who knew the woods better than their own backyards. The story was always, bizarrely, the same. The witness would be miles from any road, any trail, any sign of human civilization, deep in the primordial ancient forests of the park's vast southern sector. And they would see a man. He was always described in the same way, dressed in a pristine, dark 1950s-era business suit, complete with a crisp shirt, a narrow tie, and a gray fedora pulled down slightly over his brow. He was utterly out of place, a black and white photograph dropped into a world of vibrant, chaotic green. But his attire wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what he was doing. He would be walking calmly and deliberately up a non-existent staircase. Every witness described the motion with a baffling consistency. The slight upward tilt of his torso, the rhythmic, measured lift of his knees, the way his polished, black leather shoes would rise and then plant themselves firmly on an invisible riser, bearing his full weight. He was, unmistakably, climbing a flight of stairs. But there were no stairs. There was nothing. He was simply walking, step by impossible step, up into the empty air, ascending at a perfect 45-degree angle. He would climb for perhaps 10 or 12 steps, and then, without any sound or ceremony, he would simply fade. Like a projection when the lamp is slowly turned down, he would dissolve into the forest air, leaving nothing behind. There were never any footprints. There was never any sound, no crunch of leaves, no snap of a twig. It was a silent, recurring, and utterly nonsensical loop of film, a glitch in the scenery projected onto the forest for no one in particular. No one knew who he was. Our records held no account of a man in a suit going missing in that area. He was just an echo of an action, untethered from a person or a place. A memory of an ascent, trapped in a timeless loop. The story of the staircase man was my first indication that the phenomenon I had experienced wasn't just auditory. Could be visual as well. I started to map the locations of these sightings, and I correlated them with the locations of other gray file incidents. Pattern began to emerge. The phenomena, both visual and auditory, were more common, more active, in areas that had a history of intense, focused human trauma. There was an old, forgotten prospecting camp from the 1880s, high in the mountains, where a mine collapse had killed 7 men. Rangers patrolling that area frequently reported hearing the faint, rhythmic clang of pickaxes against rock, or the desperate shouts of men in a language they couldn't understand. There was the sight of a military plane crash from the 1960s, a debris field scattered across a remote ridge. More than one backcountry ranger had reported seeing the brief, terrifying flicker of a massive fire engulfing the hillside, or smelling the phantom scent of burning aviation fuel, only to have it vanish in an instant. These places, I began to theorize, were psychically scarred. They were damaged landscapes, where the sheer emotional energy of a tragic event had been so powerful that it had permanently impressed itself upon the environment. The rock, the trees, the very air itself had become a recording medium. And sometimes, when the atmospheric conditions were just right, it would play back. But the phenomenon wasn't always a passive, historical playback. As the years went on, the reports became stranger. It was as if the recording tape was beginning to degrade, the data becoming corrupted. This led to a new kind of event, something we came to call the flicker. A respected senior ranger named Frank Henderson was the first to report it in detail. He was a man of immense experience and unflappable calm. He was on a multi-day solo patrol in a remote canyon system in the eastern parklands. He came out of that canyon 3 days early, his face pale, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold a cup of coffee. He sat in my office and told me that, for an entire afternoon, reality itself had begun to stutter. He described sitting by a stream and watching a trout leap for a fly. A moment later, he saw the exact same trout make the exact same leap, a perfect repetition. He said the stream itself seemed to flow backwards for a few seconds, the ripples moving upstream against the current. He spoke of the shadows of the pine trees, how they would lengthen dramatically as if it were late afternoon, then snap back to their noontime length, completely untethered from the actual position of the sun. He said it felt like he was watching the world through a faulty film projector, one that was skipping and repeating frames at random. It wasn't like seeing a ghost from the past. It was like the present itself was broken. Henderson, a man who had faced down grizzly bears and survived deadly storms without flinching, was deeply terrified. He retired from the service 6 months later. In his resignation letter, he simply wrote, "The world doesn't feel solid to me anymore. The sickness of seeing, I realized, wasn't just about witnessing a single ghost or hearing a strange noise. That was merely the first symptom. The true sickness was the slow, creeping, and irreversible realization that the fundamental rules of reality, time, causality, the solidity of matter were not laws. They were merely local customs. And in the deep wilderness, Far from the collective belief of the cities that holds the world together, those customs sometimes break down. You come to understand that the world is a recording, and in some places the tape is old, worn thin, and beginning to warp. The event that pushed my understanding to this new, terrifying level, the one that shifted me from a passive collector of stories to an active, obsessive investigator, was the disappearance of Ranger Tom Delgado. Tom was a good ranger. He was younger than me, in his early 30s, strong, smart, and deeply competent. He wasn't a romantic like I had been. He was a pragmatist. He knew the woods as a system, and he was one of the best I'd ever seen at navigating it. In the autumn of '92, he was assigned a routine patrol that should have been simple. A 5-day solo loop to check on a series of seldom-used patrol cabins in the park's northern wilderness, ensuring they were secure for the coming winter. When he didn't check in via radio on the morning of the 6th day, we weren't overly concerned. Radios fail. A twisted ankle can slow a man down by a day. But by the morning of day 8, with still no word, the concern had curdled into real fear. We launched a full-scale search. We found his last campsite on the 9th day. A helicopter pilot spotted the faint gray of his tent against the brown of the forest floor. The scene we found when we hiked in was one of the most chilling and inexplicable things I have ever witnessed. His tent was pitched expertly, the lines taut. His gear was laid out with military neatness. A small, perfect teepee of kindling and firewood sat in the fire ring, ready to be lit. His backpack was leaning against a log, full of his remaining food and supplies. But Tom was gone. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no tracks, bear, lion, or human leading away from the camp. His hiking boots were placed neatly at the entrance to his tent, as if he'd taken them off before settling in for the night. And then we saw the detail that made the blood freeze in our veins. Lying on his neatly rolled sleeping bag was his handheld radio, and placed with meticulous, deliberate care right next to it was the radio's heavy battery pack, which he had calmly unscrewed and removed. Think about that. It wasn't a dead battery. He had actively, consciously dismantled his only link to the outside world, his only hope of being found, and then vanished into thin air, leaving his boots behind. It was an act of profound and baffling strangeness. It was a ritual. The search continued for 2 more weeks. We covered hundreds of square miles. We found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity, suggesting a sudden and acute psychological event that led him to wander off. But I knew that wasn't it. A few weeks later, it was my sad duty to clean out his locker at the main ranger station. Inside a copy of a worn paperback novel, I found a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was his personal journal. I know I should have turned it over, but a powerful, grim instinct told me to read it first. His last few entries, written on the patrol, documented his descent into the heart of the sickness. He described his journey into the northern wilderness. He wrote about a growing sense of deep unease, a feeling that the landscape was unwell, and then he wrote about the flicker. His entry from 2 days before he disappeared read, "The scenery feels wrong today. Keep skipping. I saw the same buck, a big 8-pointer, run past my cabin 3 times in the space of an hour. It wasn't 3 different deer. It was the same one. The same gait, the same path, the same leap over the same fallen log. Like a film loop stuck on repeat. I feel like I'm walking through someone else's memory. The air is heavy." His final entry, dated the evening before he was last seen, was almost illegible. His usually neat handwriting a frantic, panicked scrawl. "It's getting worse. The flicker is constant now. The world feels like it's coming apart. But it's not just the scenery anymore. I saw a man. Just for a second. He was standing right where my tent is now. He looked like an old prospector, bearded, ragged clothes. He was just staring at me. Then he flickered, and when he reappeared, he was me. He was wearing my uniform. He was standing over a sleeping bag, and he was taking the battery out of his radio. My radio. I saw him do it. It wasn't a memory of the past. It was something else. I'm getting out of here at first light. This place is broken. But he never did get out. He didn't have a breakdown. He didn't wander off. He saw a projection, an echo of his own immediate future. He saw the very act that would seal his fate. And in his terror, in his attempt to understand or perhaps defy what he saw, he fulfilled the prophecy. He became the ghost he had witnessed. The place hadn't just replayed a memory of the past. It had shown him a memory of the future, a groove in the record that he was now destined to fall into. That was the moment my understanding underwent its final, terrible evolution. This wasn't a passive force, a simple playback of historical trauma. This was an active, environmental process, a fundamental breakdown in the laws of cause and effect. The wilderness wasn't just a recording. It was a recording that could write its own endings. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that I had to find the source. I had to find the projector. The disappearance of Tom Delgado was not just another gray file. It was a catalyst. It was the match that lit a slow-burning fire of fear and obsession that had been building in me for over a decade. Tom hadn't just seen an echo of the past. He had been consumed by an echo of the future. The phenomenon, the sickness, wasn't just a passive playback. It was interactive. It was predatory. And the knowledge of that lit a new kind of fire in me. My fear, while still present, was eclipsed by a desperate, all-consuming need to understand the mechanism of it. Where did the echoes come from? What was the source of the flicker? What was the engine driving this quiet, creeping madness? I dedicated the next 10 years of my career to a private, clandestine quest. On the surface, I was a model senior ranger. But in my off hours, my cabin became a nerve center for an investigation no one knew I was conducting. The walls were covered in topographical maps of the park, each one dotted with colored pins marking the location of every gray file incident I had ever collected. Red pins for auditory events, blue for visual, yellow for temporal distortions, the flicker. I cross-referenced these with historical archives, geological surveys, and old prospectors' journals. I was looking for a pattern, a common denominator, a geographical nexus. And slowly, painstakingly, one emerged. The pins on my map were not scattered randomly. They formed a distinct and terrifying constellation. They clustered, becoming denser and more frequent, around one specific area. It was a place in the heart of the park's most remote and inaccessible wilderness, a place few rangers ever went, a place that had more yellow and black pins, the black pins I used for disappearances, than any other. It was a vast, bowl-shaped valley, 20 miles across, ringed by a fortress of saw-toothed peaks. A place the old maps had called, with unnerving accuracy, the Silent Basin. It was an appropriate name. On the rare occasions rangers had skirted its edges, they all reported the same thing: a profound, unnatural quiet. The unique topography of the surrounding peaks created a kind of acoustic dead zone, blocking out the wind. And for reasons no biologist could ever fully explain, the basin supported very little wildlife. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, no elk herds. To walk into the Silent Basin, they said, was to walk into a world without sound, a vacuum. It was a place that felt profoundly empty. But as I stared at the dense cluster of pins on my map, I was beginning to believe it wasn't empty at all. It was full. It was the source. It was the hard drive, saturated with the corrupted data of 150 years of tragedy. Official park policy designated the Silent Basin as a limited-access ecological research zone. The official reason was to protect its unique, high-altitude tundra and a stand of ancient, gnarled bristlecone pines that grew on its rim. But the old-timers like me, we knew the real reason. It was a soft quarantine. It was the Park Service's quiet, unwritten way of drawing a line around a place that was fundamentally unwell. It was too active, too dangerous. But I had to go. Tom Delgado's ghost demanded it. My own sanity, paradoxically, demanded it. I had to see the source of the sickness, even if it meant being consumed by it. I planned my expedition with the meticulous care of an astronaut preparing for a mission to a hostile planet. I couldn't request a patrol into the basin. It would be denied immediately. So I lied. I falsified a patrol route on my official request form, creating a plausible 10-day solo loop through the adjacent mountain range, citing the need to survey for signs of a new fungal blight on the high-altitude timberlinea lie just believable enough to pass muster. I packed my standard gear for a long solo trip: tent, food, cold-weather clothing. But I also packed my secret research tools: a professional-grade, highly sensitive audio recorder with extra batteries, a handheld electromagnetic field meter, and my old, reliable 35mm camera, loaded with high-speed film. I wasn't going as a ranger. I was going as an investigator, a ghost hunter, a man walking knowingly into the heart of the haunted house. The journey to the edge of the basin was a grueling 3-day hike. It was a physical trial that pushed my middle-aged body to its limits, a journey through rough, untamed country that grew wilder and more desolate with every mile. But the real journey began the moment I crested the final, knife-edged ridge and got my first look down into the Silent Basin itself. The view was breathtaking and deeply, deeply wrong. It was a vast, perfectly circular valley, its floor a patchwork of gray tundra and black, volcanic rock. It looked like a wound on the earth, a giant impact crater. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a remote wilderness. It was a pressurized, aggressive absence of sound that made my ears ache and my jaw tense. It was the silence of a soundproofed room, a silence that felt heavy, like a physical weight. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. The second thing was my EMF meter. I switched it on, expecting the near-zero reading of a normal wilderness area, far from any power lines. Instead, the needle leaped to life, jumping erratically into the middle of the gauge, twitching and spasming like the needle of a seismograph during an earthquake. The entire valley was saturated with a powerful, fluctuating, and completely inexplicable electromagnetic field. A knot of cold dread formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. I had come too far. I began my descent. I made my first camp just below the rim, on a flat shelf of rock overlooking the vast, silent expanse. I set up my tent, and then I set up my audio recorder, placing the sensitive microphone on a tripod and letting it run as darkness fell. The night was moonless, the stars so bright and clear in the thin air that they looked like holes punched in a black ceiling. Yet down in the basin, there was a strange, pervasive darkness, a gloom that seemed to swallow the starlight. Sleep was impossible. The silence was too loud. I felt exposed, watched, not by a predator but by the valley itself. I felt like a bacterium on a slide, being observed by a dispassionate scientist. The next morning, my hands trembling slightly, I rewound the tape and played it back through my headphones. My blood ran cold. The recording was not silent. It was a horrifying, multi-layered cacophony of sound. It was a sea of whispers, faint, overlapping voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once. It was the sound of 1,000 crossed wires, 1,000 phantom radio signals bleeding into one another. I could make out snippets of English, the frantic cadence of a man shouting orders. I could hear the lilt of Spanish, a woman weeping softly. I heard what sounded like German, and the soft, guttural tones of a Native American dialect I didn't recognize. And underneath it all, woven through the tapestry of whispers, was a sound that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The faint, hopeless, terrified crying of a very young child. The basin wasn't empty. It was crowded. It was a repository of every voice that had ever cried out in pain or terror within its borders. I spent the next 5 days moving through that haunted landscape, a journey into the heart of a collective nightmare. With each day, my grip on my own sanity frayed a little more. The flicker that had driven Tom Delgado to madness was a constant, low-level reality here. It was like walking through a world with a terrible stutter. A large boulder would be in one position, and I'd glance away at my compass, and when I looked back, the boulder would have moved 10 feet to the left. The sun, instead of moving in a smooth arc, would seem to jump across the sky in discrete, jarring steps. Time itself felt fluid and unstable, like trying to walk on the surface of water. The visual echoes were everywhere, no longer confined to the periphery of my vision. They were right in front of me, transparent and shimmering like heat haze. I would see a group of gaunt, bearded men who looked like they'd stepped out of a 19th century photograph, swinging phantom pickaxes against a rock face that wasn't there. A massive, prehistoric bison, its fur shaggy and its horns impossibly wide, would charge silently across a meadow and simply vanish into thin air. The place was a soup, a chaotic stew of overlapping, fragmented memories from a dozen different eras, all playing at once on a loop. I pushed on, driven by my single-minded obsession. I was following the EMF meter, which grew steadily more erratic, the needle twitching more violently, the closer I got to the geographical center of the basin. I knew I was getting close to the source. The whispers grew louder, now audible even without the recorder, a constant, faint murmur just at the edge of my hearing. Finally, on the 6th day, I found it. The epicenter, the projector. It was a cave. The entrance was a narrow, vertical slit, a dark wound at the base of a bizarre, twisted spire of black, glassy obsidian that rose from the flat valley floor like a broken tooth. The EMF meter went completely berserk as I approached, the needle slamming violently against its peg. The air grew frigid, and it carried the sharp, sterile smell of ozone, like the air after a powerful lightning strike. I knew with every fiber of my being that I should not go in. This was the heart of the sickness. This was the place that had swallowed Tom Delgado. Every instinct I possessed, every primal survival mechanism honed by millions of years of evolution, screamed at me to turn around and run. But 20 years of obsession is a powerful and terminal disease. I had to see. I had to know. I switched on my powerful headlamp, took a deep breath of the cold, ozone-tinged air, and stepped through the fissure into the absolute darkness. The cave was not deep. It was a single, large, dome-shaped chamber, perhaps 50 feet across. And as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was not completely dark. The walls themselves were alive with a faint, shimmering internal light. It was a sickly green phosphorescence, a natural fluorescence in the strange, obsidian-like rock. And it pulsed. It pulsed gently, in perfect time with the violent, rhythmic spasms of the needle on my EMF meter. It was as if the entire chamber was breathing. But the light was not the most terrifying thing in that cave. The most terrifying thing was what the pulsing, green light revealed. The walls of the cave were not smooth. They were covered in images. But they weren't petroglyphs, carved into the rock by human hands. They were projections. Faint, flickering, moving images playing out directly on the curved rock face like a panoramic cinema screen. I had found the source. I had walked into the projector room for the entire valley, and I saw it all. On one wall, I saw the silent, looping film of the staircase man. There he was, in his perfect 1950s suit, walking calmly, deliberately, up the pulsing green wall before fading into nothing, only to reappear at the bottom and begin his ascent again. On another section of the wall, I saw the raw, brutal memory of Ethan Hayes. I saw the moment he lost his footing on the needle, his face a mask of shock and pain, his body tumbling through empty space. I saw a little girl in a faded calico dress who, according to park records, had wandered away from her family's picnic in 1934 and was never seen again. She was sitting on the cave floor, her projection so real I felt I could touch it. She was crying silently, her face smudged with dirt, her tiny image flickering and transparent. She was the child I had heard weeping on my recorder. And then the projections began to break down, to overlap, to merge in a horrifying montage of corrupted memory. The falling climber flickered, and for a terrifying second, he was wearing the staircase man's suit, his body falling in a crisp, businesslike fashion. The little girl in the calico dress opened her mouth to cry, but it was my own voice that came out, a perfect echo of my terrified shout into the radio from the meadow all those years ago. Help! Somebody, help me! And then I saw Tom Delgado. His projection was the clearest of all. It was as if his recording was the newest, the freshest. He was standing there, clear as day, looking directly at me from the cave wall with empty, haunted eyes. He was wearing his green and gray ranger uniform. He calmly, methodically, took the battery out of his radio, placed it on the ground, and then his image flickered violently. He merged with the projection of the old, bearded prospectors. His uniform dissolved into their ragged clothes. His face became gaunt and bearded. He picked up a phantom pickaxe, turned his back on me, and joined the others, hammering silently at the cave wall, becoming just another one of the ghosts, his modern identity subsumed, recorded over by the valley's older, stronger memories. He hadn't just died. He had been assimilated. That was the moment I broke. The sheer, crushing totality of it all that stored trauma, all that looping, corrupted memory, all that pain crashed down on me in a psychic wave. This place wasn't evil. It was a wound in the fabric of the world. It was a cancer of memory that had metastasized on the landscape. It was a place where time had shattered into a million sharp, glittering pieces, and I was standing barefoot in the middle of the wreckage. I screamed. I don't know for how long. It was a raw, animal sound of pure terror. I dropped my equipment, my precious meter and recorder forgotten. I scrambled out of that cave, out of that pulsing green light and its chorus of weeping ghosts. I ran. I ran blindly through the flickering, stuttering landscape, chased by the phantoms of 100 different tragedies. I did not stop running until I had clawed my way up the ridge and out of the silent basin, out of that terrible, profound quiet, and back into a world where time, for the most part, still held. I don't remember the journey back from the silent basin. It exists in my mind not as a sequence of events, but as a disjointed, feverish montage of images, stumbling through endless woods, falling and getting up again, my hands and knees raw and bleeding, the taste of blood and dirt in my mouth. I have a vague memory of being found by another ranger on a trail I don't remember reaching, of being half carried to his truck, of the blessed, mundane sound of the engine turning over. My official record states that I was in the park hospital for 2 weeks, treated for severe exhaustion, dehydration, and exposure. That was the neat, tidy medical explanation for what had happened. It was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one. How could I have told them the truth? How could I explain that the real ailment was not of the body, but of the soul? That I had been exposed not to the elements, but to the raw, unfiltered source code of reality, and that it had burned out my circuits. I never filed a patrol log for my trip into the silent basin. My expensive equipment, the audio recorder, the EMF meter, my beloved camera, I left it all behind on the floor of that glowing, whispering cave. A foolish, superstitious part of me hoped that leaving it there would be an offering, a plea to the place to not let its sickness follow me out. When I returned to duty, I was a different man. The person who had marched into that valley with a fire of obsessive curiosity was gone. That fire had been extinguished, smothered by the cold, dead ash of understanding. I had seen the source. I had looked into the flawed, stuttering mechanism of reality itself, and the knowledge was a permanent, incurable poison. It was the sickness, and I now carried it in my bones. The world no longer felt solid. It had lost its integrity. I would be sitting in the ranger station, talking to a tourist about bear safety, and out of the corner of my eye, the fluorescent lights on the ceiling would seem to flicker in that specific, jarring way. I would catch myself staring at a coffee cup on my desk, half expecting it to shimmer and be replaced by a rusted tin mug from 100 years ago. The low-level, electromagnetic hum of the basin, the sound I had only been able to detect with a sensitive meter, now seemed to be permanently ingrained in my hearing. A psychic tinnitus that I could never, ever escape. I had brought the ghost of the place home with me. This is the final, terminal stage of the sickness of seeing. It's not about what you witness in the wilderness anymore. It's when you can no longer reliably separate the real world from the echo. It's when you realize with a cold, sinking dread that the glitches are not confined to remote, forgotten valleys. They are everywhere all the time. It's just that, in the quiet of the wild, you can perceive them. In the loud, chaotic, and densely populated reality of the city, they are drowned out, their effects averaged into a semblance of normalcy by the collective belief of millions. But for me, the damage was done. I could now see the seams in the wallpaper of the world, and I began to see the same sickness in others. I started to recognize the look in the eyes of the other senior rangers, the ones who, like me, had spent decades in the deep backcountry. It was a particular kind of weariness, a haunted, distant look that resided far behind their professional smiles. It was the look of a man who is constantly listening for a sound that no one else can hear. We never, ever spoke about it directly. To give it words would be to give it a power it did not deserve. But we developed a kind of silent, unspoken communion. We had a secret fraternity of the damned. We'd be in a morning briefing, and the chief would announce a new disappearance, a hiker vanishing without a trace from a certain active area of the park. I would glance across the room at a man like Bill Peterson, a ranger with 30 years in the Western District, and I would see it. Not surprise, not even sadness, just a flicker of profound, weary recognition in his eyes. He would give me a barely perceptible nod. No words were needed. He knew. I knew. We both knew the hiker hadn't been eaten by a bear or fallen into a ravine. He had simply stepped on a weak spot in the tape and been recorded over. This is the real, unspoken reason rangers retire. It isn't the physical toll. We are a tough breed. We can handle the aching knees and the sore backs. It isn't even the emotional toll of pulling bodies from crevasses. We learn to compartmentalize that. We are driven out by a cumulative psychic damage. Every flicker you see, every phantom voice you hear, every glimpse into the abyss of a place like the silent basin, it leaves a small, hairline fracture on your soul. After 20 or 30 years, those tiny fractures spiderweb across your entire psyche, and you live in a constant, low-grade terror that one day, the next flicker, the next echo will be the one that shatters you completely. You fear, above all else, that you will end up like Tom Delgado. You fear that the landscape has already recorded your own final, looping scene, and that you are just walking day by day, closer to the point where you fulfill your role in it. And so you leave, you run, you seek out the places with the least amount of memory. New houses in new suburbs, tract homes built on land that was empty farmland a year ago. Places where the psychic static is low. You trade the majestic, terrible silence of the deep wilderness for the mundane, predictable, and blessedly loud noise of civilization. The drone of highway traffic, the chatter of a 24-hour news channel, the hum of a refrigerator. These sounds become a kind of comforting white noise, a shield that helps to drown out the whispers that still echo in the quiet moments. You do not retire to a quiet cabin in the woods. That would be a death sentence. My own resignation was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. I had one last conversation that sealed my decision, the final fracture that broke me. It was with my best friend, a ranger named Dave Jensen. Dave and I had started in the service around the same time. We had come up through the ranks together. He was my rock, the only person to whom I had ever hinted at the true nature of my research, as I once called it. He was a pragmatist, a skeptic, but he was a good listener, and he never called me crazy, which I was always grateful for. He just thought I had a morbid imagination. It was late autumn, the season when the park grows quiet and the air feels heavy with impending change. We were working together on a routine patrol, repairing a small wooden footbridge over a deep, narrow gorge in the western sector. It was a beautiful place, but it had a history. A small, doomed family of settlers had tried to build a cabin there in the 1890s and had all frozen to death during a particularly brutal winter. It was known among the veterans as the Flickery Spot, a place with a deep, sad memory. We were working, pulling up old, rotten planks, the sound of our hammers echoing in the canyon. And then, for a brief moment, the world stuttered. The light seemed to waver, to dim and then brighten again. The sharp, crisp sound of my hammer striking a nail became a dull, muddy thud with a strange, delayed echo. It was a minor event, the kind of low-grade flicker I had grown grimly accustomed to. I paused and looked up, and I saw that Dave had frozen. He was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his own hammer. He was staring, his eyes wide and unfocused, at the far side of the gorge. "What is it?" I asked, my voice quiet. "I just saw," he started, his voice a choked, disbelieving whisper. "I just saw an old man, standing over there by that big pine tree. An old man with a white beard. He was wearing my jacket. My favorite red and black flannel one. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I knew what this was. It's just an echo, Dave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to reassure both him and myself. "It's one of the old settlers, maybe. The place is just mixing up the images. Don't worry about it." "No," he said, turning to look at me. And the look in his eyes was not one of panic or confusion. It was one of horrifying, absolute certainty. It wasn't a settler, Art. It was me. I know it was me. I was old. My hair was all white. And I was looking for something. I was patting my pockets, looking agitated. I was looking for my glasses. I think I dropped them." He slowly, mechanically, reached into his own breast pocket and pulled out his reading glasses, holding them up in his trembling hand as if they were a piece of damning evidence. He had just witnessed a perfect, high-definition projection of himself, 30 or 40 years in the future, standing in this exact spot, an old man looking for his lost glasses. We finished repairing the bridge in a profound and heavy silence. We didn't speak a single word for the rest of the day. A week later, Dave Jensen, at the age of 48, in perfect physical health, put in his retirement papers. He sold his house, the beautiful log cabin near the park entrance where he had always planned to live out his days. He bought a brand new RV, and without saying goodbye to most of his friends, he moved to a flat, sun-bleached, featureless RV park in the middle of the Arizona desert. A place with no trees, no mountains, no gorges, and absolutely no history. The last time I spoke to him on the phone, his voice sounded thin and distant. He told me he couldn't stand the thought of growing old, of one day putting on that red flannel jacket and fumbling for his glasses. He couldn't live in a world where he had seen the last page of his own story. He said he had to get out of the book entirely before he was forced to act it out. That's when I knew, with a final, crushing certainty, that I had to leave too. Dave's experience crystallized the ultimate horror of the sickness. It's not just about witnessing the ghosts of others. It's the chilling, paralyzing realization that the wilderness might have already recorded your own, and that you might spend the rest of your life just walking toward that pre-recorded moment, a puppet waiting for the strings to be pulled. My own resignation was quiet. I handed my badge to the park superintendent, a man who had seen his own share of gray files over the years. I cited personal health reasons. He didn't ask any questions. He just looked at me with those same knowing, tired, haunted eyes I had seen in so many of the others. He shook my hand. "Get some rest, Art," was all he said, and I knew he understood. He knew I wasn't going to rest. I was going to run. The testimony you have just heard is a heavy one. It is a look behind the curtain, a glimpse into the profound and unsettling truths that can be found in the world's last wild places. It serves as a stark reminder that the wilderness is not a park to be managed, but a power to be respected. It makes you wonder how many other rangers carry similar burdens, their silence a shield against memories that would shatter our comfortable reality. The smiling face on the postcard hides a story and a warning. The next time you find yourself at the edge of the woods, looking into the deep shadows, remember these words. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is not benign. It holds more than just trees and rocks. It holds secrets, and it keeps them well. If you understand that some truths are best left unknown, you have found your station. Subscribe to the Wilderness Protocol and always respect the wild. Thank you for listening.